The Death of the CEO, a Bernard Miller Mystery, Part 1, The Final Call. Michael Friedman hadn't felt this way since his darkest days, his mind trapped in a swirl of panic, fear, and regret. He gazed out of his high-rise window, Manhattan's skyline stretching into the dimming evening, yet offering no relief from the turmoil gnawing at him. He was reeling from the last phone call with Frank Peterson, a notoriously dangerous businessman who had screamed a flurry of threats that still echoed in Michael's ears. Frank had every right to be furious. Every client they'd ever had was in financial ruin. Millions gone, wiped out with no trace, and Michael knew exactly why. Russia, he thought bitterly, cursing his partner, Albert Tussman, for convincing him to take this risk. The scheme Albert had pushed would triple client investments, promising incredible returns with some new foreign investment company. But Michael hadn't realized the full extent of the plan until it was too late, until those triple returns became empty promises and their clients' accounts vanished into nothingness. His pulse pounded as he clutched his desk, bracing himself. Just days ago, Albert had spoken so confidently, insisting this would be their ticket to the highest financial tier in New York. Now Albert was nowhere to be found, unreachable since yesterday, leaving Michael to face the disaster alone. The phones in the office shrieked endlessly, a cacophony of fury and desperation. He tried to steady himself, muttering the recovery mantra he'd leaned on during his years of sobriety. This too shall pass. But it felt hollow. This time, there was no one to save him from the collapse he'd walked into with open eyes. The room spun, and he felt the panic rise to his throat, clawing to get out. His hands shook as he rubbed his temples, feeling the urge he'd fought for years creep back in, strong and insistent. A soft knock at his office door jolted him, and Barbara Messner, his loyal secretary of 8 years, peeked in. Her face was pale, her brow creased with worry. "Michael, the phones, they won't stop ringing. Clients are screaming for answers, demanding to speak with you and Albert. What should I tell them?" She hugged her arms, as though protecting herself from the rage and despair that poured through the phone lines. Michael clenched his jaw, the weight of his own helplessness twisting in his gut. He knew he couldn't give her the answers she needed. Not now, and maybe not ever. "Go home, Barbara," he said, voice thick and barely above a whisper. She hesitated, concern flickering in her eyes, but he cut her off, his desperation spilling over. "Just go home." The words hung heavily between them, and Barbara stepped back, hurt and confusion flashing across her face, before she silently closed the door. Michael exhaled, tension surging through his shoulders. He needed something to numb the anxiety gnawing at him, pulling him back to habits he thought he'd conquered years ago. He moved to Albert's office. The smell of leather and polished wood filled the room, pristine as always in Albert's meticulous style. Opening the bottom drawer of the heavy filing cabinet, he found the bottle of Glenfiddich Scotch, hidden among meticulously labeled files. The golden liquid glistened in the dim light, a temptation he couldn't resist tonight. Pouring himself a generous drink, he downed it in one burning gulp, the alcohol soothing his nerves even as guilt prickled at the edge of his mind. He poured another, sinking into Albert's plush leather chair, his eyes falling on the panoramic view from the corner office. His mind drifted to the first days of Tussman and Friedman, a partnership that had once represented ambition, trust, and shared dreams. Now all those dreams lay shattered, slipping through his fingers like sand. He couldn't shake the feeling that somehow Albert had left him to deal with the mess alone, abandoning him just as everything came crashing down. He closed his eyes, letting the alcohol lull him into a momentary peace, a false calm. The phones buzzed faintly in the background, their shrill urgency dampened by the scotch in his veins. Just as he began to drift, a sharp, sudden sound of glass shattering jolted him awake. His eyes shot open, barely registering the glint of shattered glass before he felt a searing heat tear through his skull. A bullet sliced cleanly through his forehead, his body slumping backward as darkness took him. The bottle of Glenfiddich slipped from his lifeless fingers, crashing to the floor in a spray of amber shards, soaking into the luxurious carpet of Albert's office. Detective Bernard Miller takes the case. Hours later, Bernard Miller arrived on the scene, the distant hum of New York City life a muted backdrop to the controlled chaos within the office. Bernard moved through the shattered glass and pools of spilled scotch, his senses sharp, taking in the eerie silence of the place. It felt too quiet, too hollow, as though the office held its breath, guarding secrets that Bernard would have to dig out. Detective Cynthia Toussaint was already there, her steady gaze meeting his as he approached. She gave him a quick summary, though her eyes hinted at the confusion they all felt. "Shot straight through the forehead," she said, gesturing to the broken window. "A high-caliber sniper round, fired from one of the buildings across 34th Street. We're still searching for the exact location." Sniper hit? Right through the window? Bernard's mind raced with the precision of the kill. Whoever did this wanted it clean, unmistakable. It wasn't a robbery or random attack. This was an execution. He glanced at the bullet's trajectory, aligning it with the open blinds and the shattered pane. The shooter had taken time to set this up. This was personal. Cynthia handed him a list of recent calls, one entry particularly underlined: Frank Peterson. "He's not exactly discreet," Cynthia said dryly, "and he was one of the last calls Friedman took. Apparently threatened him a few hours before the shooting." Bernard's jaw tightened as he read through the notes. Peterson was a notorious figure, linked to several murky dealings across the city. But he was also smart, too smart to leave such an obvious trail unless he wanted the police to find it. Bernard's gaze shifted to the closed door of Albert Tussman's office, an unease settling in his chest. "Where's the partner?" he asked. Cynthia shook her head. "Nowhere to be found. No sign of him since yesterday. His phone's off, and no one's seen him at his usual spots." Bernard's instincts fired up. The missing partner, the threat-laden calls, the high-stakes financial scheme, and now a bullet through Michael's head, all pieces in a twisted game. As he surveyed the scene, he felt the weight of a shadowy presence lurking behind the brutal killing, a silent force that would drive them down a dark path before they found answers. This case would lead him into dangerous territories, and he knew it would take everything he and his team had to untangle the deadly web surrounding Michael Friedman's murder. He gave Cynthia a nod, steeling himself as he prepared to dive headlong into the mystery ahead, one that would pit him against ruthless adversaries determined to keep the truth buried. Part 2. The Web of Lies. The morning air was heavy as Bernard strode into Tussman and Friedman's sleek office lobby, an imposing blend of polished granite and frosted glass that now seemed to radiate an aura of dread. The receptionist's desk sat empty, a few phones still off their hooks, blinking and beeping like mourners who hadn't received the memo of death. Bernard's gaze moved over the quiet chaos, taking in the fragments of a once bustling financial empire now shrouded in silence and suspicion. Detective Hector Ramirez was waiting for him at the elevators, his usually calm demeanor tinged with frustration. As soon as Bernard stepped out, Hector launched into his report, a thick file in hand. "Bernie, we've got a mess on our hands," Hector said, shaking his head. "The firm's in total disarray. Clients are bleeding money, accounts drained dry, and Michael Friedman ends up dead, just as everything hits the fan." But that's not the end of it. "What else?" Bernard asked, already sensing the depths of the conspiracy they were about to dive into. Hector glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Albert Tussman, the partner, is missing. We combed through his contacts, checked all his properties, and followed up with his family and friends. Nothing. It's like he vanished right before the firm imploded." The thought simmered in Bernard's mind, the image of Albert's empty office and his silent, mocking absence filling in the gaps of a dark scenario. Bernard took the file from Hector and flipped it open, scanning the background on Tussman and Friedman. The partnership had started strong, quickly turning into one of the most sought-after firms in New York, catering to elite clients with big money and, apparently, an even bigger appetite for risk. "What do we know about the missing money?" Bernard asked, his brows furrowing. "That's where it gets interesting. According to the preliminary audit, their accounts show over 300 clients, funds transferred into various offshore banks over the past 6 months. The transfers all trace back to a company registered in Russia. The name?" Hector hesitated, looking Bernard in the eye. "Petro Invest Holdings." Bernard's face hardened as the pieces began to fall into place. Frank Peterson's threat just hours before Michael's death was no coincidence. Peterson was one of Tussman and Friedman's biggest clients, and it seemed one of the firm's biggest headaches. Peterson's angry because his own accounts were emptied, right? Bernard asked, flipping through Peterson's records. Is he tied to Petro-Invest? Hector shrugged. That's what we need to find out. But here's the thing, Petro-Invest Holdings is registered under a different name in every country it's been traced to. Whoever's behind it is hiding in layers upon layers of shell corporations. Bernard exhaled, frustration simmering in his chest. It was no wonder Michael had been a nervous wreck before his death. He'd been pushed into a corner, blindsided by his partner, forced to lie to clients while his own company bled them dry. Where's Peterson now? Bernard asked. We're tracking him down. Last I heard, he'd gone off the grid, probably avoiding the blowback from his clients. But I'd bet anything he knows more about this Petro-Invest business than he's letting on. Bernard's gaze settled on the photograph of Michael Friedman in the file. The man's face calm, his expression one of confidence, even pride. A stark contrast to the desperation he'd shown just before his death. He felt a pang of empathy for the man who had been trapped by his ambition, chained to his partner's ruthless schemes. As Bernard moved through the file, something else caught his eye. An email exchange between Michael and a foreign contact dated just weeks ago, flagged as urgent by Michael himself. Look at this, Bernard said, showing Hector the page. Michael was reaching out to someone named Dmitry Sokolov. He mentioned wanting to reverse a transaction for the sake of their partnership. Hector's eyes widened. Sokolov? We have his name in Peterson's connections too. Word is he's one of those international finance guys, a specialist in gray money transactions. Bernard felt his gut tighten. The deeper they went, the murkier the waters became. Every new lead seemed to pull them closer to a network of wealthy, powerful men who operated outside the rules, men who had no qualms about destroying anyone who got in their way. He handed the email back to Hector, and they moved into Albert's office, the scene of the crime still cordoned off. Police photographers and forensics were wrapping up, but Bernard's eyes were drawn to the dark stain where the bottle of Glenfiddich had shattered, mingling with blood on the carpet. The irony wasn't lost on him. Michael's last moments were spent in the office of the man who had lured him into this trap, the man who had vanished without a trace. As he surveyed the room, something out of place caught Bernard's eye, a single torn business card, barely visible under the edge of Albert's desk. He knelt down, carefully pulling it out and piecing it together. The card read, Everest Recovery Services, Jacob Moore, Director. Everest Recovery? Hector asked, leaning over. Isn't that a debt collection firm? Not just any debt collection, Bernard murmured, piecing the connections together. They handle high-risk accounts for companies dealing with difficult clients. They're known to use unconventional methods to get their money back. The implications hit them both like a punch to the gut. Everest Recovery wasn't just a collection agency. It was Peterson's insurance policy, a way to recover his money without resorting to the law. This card confirmed that Peterson was already circling, prepared to take his money back by force if necessary. Bernard pocketed the card, a new determination settling in him. We need to pay Jacob Moore a visit. He might know more about who else Peterson is tied to and where to find him. Later that day, Everest Recovery headquarters, Bernard and Hector made their way to the Everest Recovery offices, tucked discreetly into an unmarked building in the meatpacking district. Jacob Moore's office was exactly as they expected, sleek, understated, and cold. The man himself, dressed in an expensive tailored suit, greeted them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Detectives, Moore said smoothly, gesturing for them to sit. I was wondering if you'd show up. We've heard about Mr. Friedman's tragic passing. A sad, sad loss. Let's cut to it, Moore, Bernard said, his voice low and firm. We know Peterson was one of Friedman's biggest clients, and he had every reason to be furious. He hired you to get his money back, didn't he? Moore's smile didn't waver, though his eyes narrowed slightly. Everest Recovery takes client confidentiality very seriously, Detective. I'm afraid I can't confirm or deny that Mr. Peterson is or ever was one of our clients. Bernard leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. Let me make this clear, Moore. We're investigating the murder of a high-profile CEO, a murder that seems tied to missing millions and dangerous connections. If Everest Recovery is involved, it's in your best interest to cooperate. Moore's jaw tightened ever so slightly, his composed exterior slipping. Detectives, I assure you, Everest Recovery operates within the bounds of the law. We don't engage in anything beyond what's necessary to recover debts. Hector scoffed, unable to hide his contempt. Necessary, huh? So what's necessary to people like you? Strong-arm tactics? Threats? Moore's mask finally cracked, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Let's just say we ensure that our clients receive justice for unpaid debts, in whatever form that takes. Bernard felt a chill run down his spine. Moore's words confirmed what he'd suspected. Everest Recovery played by its own rules, and they were willing to bend the law if it meant getting results. As they left Moore's office, Bernard's mind churned with possibilities. Peterson, Everest Recovery, Tussman's disappearance, and Michael's death were all part of a deadly game, one that went beyond simple embezzlement or fraud. He knew that they were up against men who wouldn't stop until they had their money back, and they were willing to kill for it. This case had just become more dangerous than he'd anticipated, but he was resolved. He would follow the trail until he uncovered the truth, no matter where it led, and he knew that as the stakes grew higher, he'd have to watch his back every step of the way. Part 3. Into the Shadows. The city buzzed with a different kind of energy as Bernard returned to his office, the mystery of Tussman and Friedman gnawing at him. Every clue they'd uncovered pointed to a meticulously planned heist, one where greed had outgrown conscience and left a bloody trail in its wake. With Albert Tussman still missing and Peterson looming as an aggressive threat, Bernard knew they had little time before the next move in this deadly game. Detective Cynthia Toussaint had spent the afternoon digging through Everest Recovery's records, cross-referencing client connections. She had an uncanny ability to connect dots that others might miss, and tonight, her diligence was paying off. "Bernie," Cynthia called out as he walked through the door. "You're going to want to see this." She handed him a dossier, her expression tight with focus. Inside was a list of Everest Recovery's clientele, obtained through some back channels and an old favor Cynthia was cashing in. As Bernard scanned the names, one entry immediately leapt off the page. Dmitry Sokolov, Petro Invest Holdings, LLC. He felt his pulse quicken. "This guy again," he muttered. "So he's not only handling offshore accounts for the Tussman and Friedman scheme, but he's tied directly to Everest Recovery?" Cynthia nodded. "It goes even deeper. Sokolov has ties to multiple shell companies around the globe, several of which are linked to cases of fraud and asset stripping. Our missing partner, Albert, may have thought he was being clever using Sokolov's services, but it's looking like Sokolov was playing Albert and Michael for his own ends." "Think he's the one who killed Friedman?" Bernard asked, glancing over at Hector, who was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching the exchange thoughtfully. "It's possible," Hector said, pushing off the wall. "But we need more than just conjecture to tie Sokolov to the murder. There's no proof he was anywhere near the office when Michael was killed. For all we know, he hired someone else to do the dirty work. Or maybe Peterson's threats weren't idle." Bernard set the file down, his mind racing. "We need to get into Michael's personal life. He might have kept records outside the office. A safe deposit box, perhaps, or a personal computer. Something that could point us to who he was trying to protect himself from." Later that evening, Michael's apartment. They tracked down Michael's address on the Upper West Side, a penthouse that was tastefully furnished but impersonal, the home of a man who barely had time to breathe outside of work. Bernard, Cynthia, and Hector entered the apartment, taking in the sterile orderliness of the place. Michael's study caught Bernard's eye, a modest room tucked away in the corner, a stark contrast to his lavish office in Midtown. The desk was tidy, with stacks of paper neatly organized and a single framed photo of Michael and a woman, likely an old girlfriend or perhaps a sister, on the desktop. Hector went to the closet and opened it. "Empty," he called out. "Not even a backup laptop." "Interesting," Bernard murmured, pulling open the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside was a slim, leather-bound journal. He thumbed through it, seeing only the first few pages were filled with tightly written, hurried notes. Most of the entries looked like lists or fragments, but one stood out, dated a week before Michael's death. Peterson demands answers. If he finds out about Albert's plan with Sokolov, I'll be held responsible. I need to find a way out of this deal or things will get ugly. Bernard handed the journal to Cynthia. There's our confirmation. Michael knew Peterson was onto them. He was scared but felt trapped. Cynthia's brow furrowed. Albert and Sokolov had to have cut Michael out of the loop once things got risky. He might not have known how far things would go until it was too late. Just then, Hector's voice cut in from the window, where he was examining the security cameras mounted on neighboring buildings. Looks like we're not the only ones interested in Michael's apartment, he said, nodding toward the street below. Bernard joined him at the window and saw a black sedan idling by the curb. He could just make out the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat, watching the building with a hawk's intensity. Bernard pulled out his phone, snapping a quick photo of the car and zooming in on the license plate. Think it's one of Everest's people? Hector asked, his eyes narrowing. Maybe, Bernard replied, slipping his phone back into his pocket. Or maybe Peterson is tired of waiting for answers and sent someone to make sure we don't uncover the truth. They left the apartment cautiously, slipping out a side exit and circling around the building until they were close enough to the sedan to catch the driver unaware. Bernard approached from the left, gesturing to Cynthia and Hector to circle right. The driver didn't see them coming until Bernard knocked on the window, startling him into fumbling for something in his glove compartment. Easy there, Bernard said as the man rolled down the window, his face twisted into an expression of reluctant compliance. Who are you? Bernard asked, his tone firm. And why are you watching Michael Friedman's apartment? The man gave a dismissive scoff, clearly not impressed. I'm just a courier. Got a message to deliver. Is that right? Hector said, leaning in. Because you look a little too interested in a dead man's apartment to be just a courier. The man smirked as if catching on to the game. Look, I don't know who you guys are, but you're messing with people who have a lot to lose. I'm just here to make sure things go smoothly. And what things would those be? Bernard pressed, his gaze unflinching. The man hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before he shrugged and turned the key in the ignition. You'll see soon enough, he muttered, pulling the car away from the curb, leaving Bernard and his team with more questions than answers. Midnight, back at Bernard's office. Bernard, Cynthia, and Hector pored over the clues they had gathered, dissecting each fragment of information in search of patterns. With every piece of evidence they uncovered, the stakes seemed to rise, like a noose tightening around them all. Peterson's pulling strings from the shadows, Everest recoveries lurking in the background, and Sokolov's the mastermind behind this financial mess, Cynthia said, rubbing her temples. But why kill Michael and let Tussman vanish? If they were in on it together, wouldn't it be easier to keep both around to cover the tracks? It's possible Michael was a liability, or maybe he knew something he wasn't supposed to, Bernard speculated. Tussman could be lying low or dead, Hector finished grimly. For all we know, Sokolov and Peterson got rid of him too. Just then, Bernard's phone rang, breaking the tense silence. It was Tanisha, his kid's babysitter, calling from his home. Tanisha? Bernard answered, his voice suddenly taut with worry. Mr. Miller, Tanisha said, her voice shaky. There's someone outside the house. I don't know who it is. They're parked right across the street and haven't moved for the last hour. I tried calling you sooner, but I didn't want to panic the kids. Bernard's heart lurched. Lock the doors, keep the kids in the living room, and stay calm. I'll be there as soon as I can. He hung up and turned to Cynthia and Hector, his face set with grim resolve. It looks like Peterson and his people are escalating this to a personal level. Cynthia's eyes flashed with anger. You take care of your family, Bernie. We'll keep tracking down Peterson and this Sokolov character. Bernard nodded gratefully, feeling the weight of the situation sink deeper into his bones. As he headed out the door, he could feel his resolve crystallizing. This was no longer just about solving a murder or uncovering fraud. It was about defending his family, his children, and his friends from a ruthless network of power-hungry men. He had a new lead to chase, but more than that, he had a reason to fight. This battle was no longer only his. It was about protecting those he loved and dismantling the very system that had preyed upon him and countless others. With determination driving him, Bernard vowed to bring every one of these predators to justice, no matter the cost. Part 4: The Unraveling. Bernard's drive home was silent, the night pressing in around him, heightening his sense of urgency. The thought of someone lurking outside his house rattled him. He had seen his fair share of violence and danger, but when it came to his children, every instinct sharpened. By the time he pulled up to the curb, the car across the street was gone, but Tanisha met him at the door, her face pale and tense. "I didn't want the kids to see," she whispered, "but he left something." She handed Bernard an unmarked envelope, her fingers trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a chilling message. "You're out of your league, Miller. Walk away, or you'll lose more than your pride." He clenched his jaw, pocketing the note. This wasn't just about intimidation. It was a reminder of what he stood to lose if he continued digging. Yet, he wouldn't stop now. Peterson, Sokolov, and whoever else was involved had gone too far. They'd threatened his family, and that meant the gloves were off. Early the next morning, the warehouse on the docks, Bernard met with Cynthia and Hector at a safe house, a dimly lit warehouse by the docks where they had planned a rendezvous. He laid out the events from last night, showing them the note. Hector scowled, his usual calm demeanor tinged with anger. "So they've officially made this personal," he said. "We've got to get leverage." Cynthia leaned in, her expression resolute. "I've done some more digging. Sokolov is holding a private party tomorrow night at an exclusive club. If we can get in, maybe we can corner him, get some intel. His connections aren't just financial. He's dealing with people in high places who might know where Albert is hiding." Hector looked skeptical. "And Peterson? He's been the one most vocal in threatening Friedman. We need something solid to bring him down." Bernard nodded. "We split up. Cynthia, you'll work your contacts, find a way into Sokolov's event. Hector, keep the pressure on Peterson's people, and see if you can shake something loose." "Got it," Hector replied. "What about you?" "I'll handle Everest Recovery," Bernard said, recalling the name that had tied so many of the loose threads together. "If this place has been a shell for Sokolov's dirty money, there'll be someone in the back office with a story to tell." The plan was set. They would reconvene later that night, but Bernard could sense the stakes rising. He had a feeling that they were closer to the truth than they had ever been, and the danger was only increasing. Nightfall, Sokolov's event at the Skyline Lounge. The Skyline Lounge was known for its elite clientele, those who could move fortunes with a single phone call. Cynthia arrived under the guise of an investor's representative, her teen instincts guiding her through the crowd of wealthy guests as she navigated her way toward Sokolov's private booth. She spotted him in the dimly lit VIP section, surrounded by an entourage that looked more like bodyguards than friends. Taking a steadying breath, Cynthia moved in, pretending to look lost as she approached one of the guards. "Excuse me, I'm here representing a very interested party," she said with a small, disarming smile. "I believe Mr. Sokolov might be open to a little business?" The guard hesitated, eyeing her up and down, then turned to Sokolov. After a nod from the man himself, Cynthia was ushered over, her pulse quickening as she was suddenly face to face with the architect of the Tussman and Friedman scandal. "Who do you work for?" Sokolov asked in a thick accent, his gaze piercing. She leaned in, dropping her voice to a whisper. "Let's just say they're very interested in what happened to Tussman and Friedman." For a moment, Sokolov's composure slipped. He sat back, his expression cold but wary. "That business is closed. But tell your employer, if they value their future, they'll leave it in the past." "Oh, I'm sure," Cynthia said smoothly, masking her excitement. "But just in case, perhaps you could tell me where I could find Albert Tussman?" Sokolov's eyes flickered with something. Fear, maybe, or realization? "Albert is no longer a concern," he said sharply. "He chose his own path." That was all Cynthia needed to hear. She rose, her expression unreadable, and left the lounge, adrenaline coursing through her as she joined Bernard and Hector outside. They had their confirmation. Sokolov knew exactly where Tussman was and had most likely orchestrated his disappearance. Meanwhile, Bernard's visit to Everest Recovery. While Cynthia worked her angle, Bernard entered the Everest Recovery Building, posing as a potential client. The receptionist, a weary-looking woman, led him to a back office where a man named Leo Jenkins, one of Sokolov's financial advisors, greeted him. Bernard settled in, his tone casual. "I'm interested in understanding how your clients benefit from offshore services. You see, I have a friend, Michael Friedman, who used to work with you, and I was curious about how that arrangement worked out." Jenkins stiffened, glancing around as if to ensure they were alone. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said with a rehearsed tone. "We don't discuss other clients' affairs." Bernard leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Come on, Leo. We both know there's more to this. Either you talk to me now, or I bring the feds here and let them comb through every account Sokolov's ever handled." Leo paled, his defiance melting into a begrudging compliance. "Okay, fine," he said, lowering his voice. "Michael and Albert weren't the only ones. Sokolov ran a dozen schemes like theirs, luring in businesses with promises of impossible returns, but they were all doomed from the start. Sokolov and his men pocketed every cent they could." "And Tussman?" Bernard pressed. "Where is he?" Jenkins hesitated, then whispered, "He's hiding. Sokolov has him stashed away somewhere upstate, but it won't be for long. Word is Sokolov plans to close that account soon." Bernard's heart pounded. They were running out of time to find Tussman before Sokolov made his final move. Midnight, converging clues. By the time Bernard, Cynthia, and Hector regrouped, the pieces of the puzzle had begun to fall into place. Sokolov's operations were a well-oiled machine of fraud, with Peterson as an enforcer to intimidate anyone who got too close to the truth. But now they had something solid, Tussman's location. They devised a plan to raid Sokolov's hideout upstate, calling in the favor of Captain Robert O'Malley to provide backup. Bernard knew this was their last shot to get Tussman alive and bring down Sokolov once and for all. As they prepared, Bernard looked at Cynthia and Hector, his resolve hardening. "Tonight we end this," he said. "No more threats, no more games." With the clock ticking and every moment weighted with danger, they set out on their final mission, ready to uncover the truth behind the deadly web of lies surrounding Tussman and Friedman. Part 5. The Final Reckoning. The drive to the remote cabin upstate was long and tense. Cynthia, seated beside Bernard, was running through possible scenarios, mentally preparing for the risks they faced. Hector, in the back seat, checked his weapon and gave Bernard a reassuring nod. Captain O'Malley's backup was set to arrive at a nearby checkpoint, but they would approach the cabin first, in case Tussman's life was at immediate risk. Bernard's mind raced with the possibilities, but his gut told him they were closing in on something far darker than they had anticipated. The cabin? Sokolov's safe house. They arrived at the edge of the property just as the last streaks of twilight faded. A single light shone from the cabin, casting shadows over the forested area. They parked at a distance, moving silently through the trees, weapons drawn. Cynthia held up a hand, signaling them to stop as she spotted a guard patrolling the perimeter. With swift precision, Hector maneuvered behind him, disabling him quietly before they advanced toward the cabin. Inside, they heard faint voices, one unmistakably that of Albert Tussman, his tone desperate and fearful. They peered through a side window to see Tussman, disheveled and terrified, handcuffed to a chair in the middle of the room. Standing over him was none other than Frank Peterson, flanked by two of Sokolov's henchmen. Peterson's voice dripped with contempt. "You really thought you could walk away, Albert? Thought you'd go on living after everything you knew about our operations? Please," Tussman stammered, his voice hoarse. I'll disappear. No one has to know anything. You can keep it all." Peterson laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "It's not about the money, Albert. It's about loyalty, and you broke it. Sokolov wants you gone, clean and simple." Hearing this, Bernard clenched his jaw. Tussman was their last shot at tying up the case, and Peterson's presence confirmed the ruthless lengths they'd go to cover up their fraud. With a quick nod, Bernard signaled to Cynthia and Hector. They moved into position, each taking an entry point to the cabin. On Bernard's count, they stormed in, weapons raised. "Freeze!" Bernard shouted, his voice commanding. The henchmen hesitated, exchanging glances before reaching for their guns, but Cynthia and Hector were faster. In a flash, shots were fired, and both henchmen collapsed, leaving Peterson alone, his hands raised in surrender. "Back away from Tussman," Cynthia ordered, her voice sharp. Peterson smirked, eyes glinting with defiance. "You have no idea what you've walked into," he sneered. "This is bigger than you or some washed-up PI." But Bernard wasn't interested in Peterson's bravado. He moved toward Tussman, pulling him from the chair and helping him to his feet. Tussman's face was pale, his body shaking with relief and fear. "Thank you," he whispered, clutching Bernard's arm. "I thought they were going to." "You'll be safe now, but we need answers," Bernard replied firmly, casting a sharp glance at Peterson. "Where's Sokolov, and what exactly did he have you and Michael caught up in?" Tussman swallowed hard, looking away as if ashamed. It was supposed to be simple: investments, high returns. But Sokolov, he's more than just an investor. He launders money for organized crime, Russian oligarchs, cartels, arms dealers. When he saw Michael was breaking, he knew we'd be liabilities. Peterson's chuckle cut through Tussman's confession. "You fools still don't get it, do you? Even if you take us down, there are others ready to take our place. You can't fight an empire." Cynthia stepped forward, eyes blazing. "You're going to prison, Peterson, where you'll be irrelevant." Peterson's eyes narrowed, and Bernard noticed his hand inching toward his jacket. Before Peterson could reach the hidden weapon, Bernard lunged, disarming him with a swift twist, sending him crashing to the floor. "Let's get him out of here," Bernard said, adrenaline still thrumming in his veins. O'Malley's team should be on their way. Back at the precinct, the final interrogation. Hours later, Peterson sat in an interrogation room, his arrogance visibly waning under the fluorescent lights. Bernard and Cynthia watched him through the one-way mirror as he squirmed, a shadow of the cocky criminal he'd been in the cabin. Finally, they entered, closing the door behind them. Bernard sat across from Peterson, his voice steady but unyielding. "You can help yourself, Peterson," Bernard began. "Tell us everything. Sokolov, his network, the offshore accounts, and who else is on his payroll." Peterson hesitated, but Bernard knew it was only a matter of time before his self-preservation instincts kicked in. "Sokolov was using Tussman and Friedman to hide millions," he admitted finally. "They'd funnel the money through fake investments, pass it through shell companies, then back to their clients. Michael? He couldn't handle the pressure. Sokolov had warned him, but he didn't listen." "What about Tussman?" Cynthia pressed. "Was he in on it from the beginning?" Peterson nodded. "Yeah, he knew, but he thought he could cut a deal when things went south. That's why he ran, to save his own skin." Bernard's jaw tightened. Michael's life had been collateral damage in a much larger game, and Tussman, the man they just saved, had been willing to sacrifice him. Cynthia shot a glance at Bernard, understanding his anger. They'd stopped the immediate threat, but the scars ran deeper than they'd imagined. Days later, the New York Times broke the story, exposing Sokolov's criminal empire, Peterson's involvement, and the collapse of Tussman and Friedman. The media swarmed the precinct for days, but Bernard kept his distance, focused on wrapping up loose ends. Back at home, Bernard watched his children play in the backyard, relief slowly settling over him. This case had taken him to the edge, tested his limits, and nearly cost him everything he held dear. But looking at his family, he knew it had been worth it. Cynthia and Hector stopped by that evening, sharing a quiet moment of reflection on the case and their victory. "We took down some powerful people," Hector said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "But I get the feeling we've just scratched the surface." Bernard nodded, glancing at his friends with a quiet smile. "Then we'll be ready." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Bernard knew he'd be fighting battles like this for as long as it took. He'd lost too much to ever walk away again. In the end, it was more than just justice for Michael Friedman. It was a step toward a safer future for his family and for everyone in the city he loved. And as long as there were people like Sokolov and Peterson, he'd be there to stop them. Back at home, Bernard took a long, deep breath as he stepped through the front door, his weariness melting away at the sight of his children, Tasha and Anthony, curled up on the couch. They looked up, smiles lighting their faces, and rushed to hug him, wrapping him in warmth and relief. Tanisha, ever patient and reliable, gave a quick wave before gathering her things, promising to be back the next day. After she left, Bernard settled on the couch. Tasha and Anthony nestled against him, chatting excitedly about their day, the details of homework, and playground victories, pulling him back into the precious, ordinary moments he sometimes took for granted. Tonight, though, he soaked it all in, more aware than ever of how close he had come to losing it all. The kids eventually drifted off to sleep, their breathing slow and even. Bernard gently laid them down and covered them with a blanket, letting his gaze linger on them as he felt a mix of gratitude and aching sadness. He walked quietly to the kitchen, where he made himself a cup of tea, Fiona's favorite ritual at the end of a long day. It had been her way of unwinding, of bringing calm back into the house, and she'd done it for them every night without fail. He could almost feel her presence, hear her laughter in the kitchen, see her eyes twinkling with warmth and humor, as if she were just in the next room. Standing by the kitchen window, Bernard looked out at the darkened street. The memories of Fiona came flooding back. Her quiet strength, the way she always knew just what to say, her unshakable support during his days in the NYPD and then in their journey to Pennsylvania. She'd encouraged him when he left the force, and it was her unwavering belief that gave him the courage to start Tech One Computers. She had been the heart of everything, his anchor and his guide. As he took a sip of tea, he felt the familiar pang of her absence, but knew that everything he was fighting for was her legacy, for her and for their family. She was gone, but her presence lived on in their children, in the way he approached his work, in the resolve that carried him forward each day. For the first time since the investigation began, he felt a quiet peace settle over him. Fiona's voice, as soft as a whisper, seemed to echo in his mind. "Keep going, Bernie. You'll find your way." And he knew he would. 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 And he knew he would.